Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us, by the way, at twitter.com/UNC knowledge. That's twitter.com/UNC knowledge. Now a distinguished fellow at the Claremont Institute, Dr. Harry Jaffa majored in English at Yale, took his doctorate at the New School for Social Research, then studied with the legendary political philosopher Leo Strauss. In 1959, Dr. Jaffa published Crisis of the House Divided, an interpretation of the issues in the Lincoln-Douglas Debates. On this book, journalist Andrew Ferguson, quote, "Crisis of the House Divided is a book that will never die, a genuine landmark in American thought. It's the greatest Lincoln book ever." 2009, this year, marks the 200th year since the birth of Abraham Lincoln, and the 50th year since the publication of Crisis of the House Divided. I am holding the University of Chicago Press's 50th anniversary edition. Professor Harry Jaffa, thank you.
You're welcome.
Segment 1, Lincoln. At Yale, during the 1930s, you fell in love with William Shakespeare so profoundly that it was your plan to write a history of Elizabethan drama. Instead...
Where did you hear that?
I've been reading up on you.
Okay.
I've been reading up on you. Instead, Abraham Lincoln, Stephen A. Douglas, and the debates of 1858. What happened? Get us from Shakespeare to Lincoln.
What happened is that I think contributed as much to Shakespeare studies as I have to Lincoln studies. My essay on the first scene in King Lear is a landmark work in Shakespearean criticism. And in addition to that, I wrote a long essay on Measure for Measure and another essay on the unity of tragedy, comedy, and history in Shakespeare, which is a survey of the Shakespearean universe. Most recently, I published a long essay on Macbeth, which happens to be Lincoln's favorite play.
All right. So Shakespeare never fell out of the long and productive life of Harry Jaffa.
My work on Shakespeare is not as well known, but I think it's just as important.
So how did you come to Lincoln?
That is a kind of hard to explain. I recently remembered that as a boy, when I was 8 or 9 years old, when my parents decorated this big house in Lawrence, which they rented in 1925, my mother put a sampler on my wall which said, "Stand with anybody who stands right. Stand with him when he is right and part with him when he goes wrong," which I later realized came from the Peoria speech. As far as I know, it made no impression whatever on me as a boy.
Lincoln in Peoria in 1854?
Right. But that's the foundational speech of Lincoln's whole career. But
and you were raised in the Northeast,
Well, I grew up in Lawrence, Long Island.
Right.
South Shore, and graduated from Lawrence High School in 1935.
So there was a sampler on your wall with, unbeknownst to you, a quotation from Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
My father was born a year after you were, and he used to tell me that when he was a boy, on the 4th of July parade in his hometown, there were still Civil War veterans marching. Was the Civil War at all a felt presence in your own boyhood?
No.
Not at all?
No. But in 1946, I was in a used bookstore on 4th Avenue in New York when I was a graduate student at the New School when I was studying with Strauss, and I happened to pick up a copy of the Lincoln-Douglas Debates. It was my custom in those days, if I found a book in a bookstore that I liked, I'd come back each day to read through more of it, since I didn't have any money. But I somehow scraped up $5 to pay for this copy of the Lincoln-Douglas Debates. I had taken no courses in American history, either as an undergraduate or as a graduate student. But I fell in love with the debates just because it was a wonderful reading. And it occurred to me...
So it was the language. The first point of contact was the power of the language?
Well, not... I saw that there was something classical. I was studying with Strauss, and I didn't see this right away, but I did after a while, that the issue between Lincoln and Douglas was not similar to, but identical to the difference between Socrates and Thrasymachus in the first book of the Republic. This question of whether or not the people make the moral law, or the moral law makes the people. Thrasymachus says justice is the interest of the stronger, which in a democracy means justice is whatever the demos, the many, were. In a tyranny, it's whatever the tyrant wants to do. In an oligarchy, it's whatever the rich want to do. But there was no idea of any law controlling the decision of the people who made these decisions. Stephen A. Douglas's position was that he let the people rule.
Segment 2, the debates. 1858, Stephen A. Douglas is the sitting senator from Illinois. He's standing for re-election for a third term. Abraham Lincoln challenges him, and they agree to debate in 7 towns in Illinois. Why did Douglas, an immensely important figure on the national stage already, deign to appear with Abraham Lincoln, a much lesser-known figure?
Well, the explanation is very simple. Lincoln used to go to Douglas's meetings, and when Douglas finished speaking, he'd get up and tell the audience, "Come back in half an hour and you can listen to me." And the price that Douglas paid, that he made Lincoln pay, was that if they had the joint debates, that Lincoln would no more come to Douglas's own meetings. So Lincoln, in effect, blackmailed Douglas into the joint debates.
Now, from August to October, Lincoln and Douglas appear in Ottawa. These are towns in, these are counties. I don't know whether they were county seats, but they're 7 towns in 7 different congressional districts in Illinois. Ottawa, Freeport, Jonesboro, Charleston, Galesburg, Quincy, and Alton.
Right.
What kinds of audiences, who were the people who would attend those debates?
Mostly farmers, because it was a farming community. But you have to realize that politics was a much more important part of everybody's life than, not merely because of the vitality of the slavery question, but because there were no theaters, there was no radio, there was no television, and there were a lot of newspapers, but they had limited circulation, and most of them weren't newspapers anyway. They were journals of opinion.
And the format of the debate was, of each debate?
The first speaker spoke for 30 minutes, for an hour. The second speaker spoke for an hour and a half, and then the first speaker closed for 30 minutes.
So that's 3 hours of debate to which these farm folks who'd driven in from the countryside would listen.
But that was not much, because when people took all this trouble to go to a political rally, they wanted their money's worth. Many of the individual meetings that Lincoln and Douglas had with their own supporters would last 3 hours. That was not unusual.
All right. From The Crisis of the House Divided, I'm quoting you. No political contest in history was more exclusively or passionately concerned with the character of the beliefs in which the souls of men were to abide. The character of the beliefs in which the souls of men were to abide. What beliefs, and in what sense do you mean to suggest that souls could abide in beliefs?
Well, first one must understand what is unique about American history and what is the basis of what is today called American exceptionalism. But recently, President Obama thought that the British thought they were exceptional, the Germans think they were exceptional. He had no idea of what American exceptionalism really meant. What it meant was that the American people, in declaring their independence, did so not on the basis of unique rights or privileges or qualities that they had, but on the basis of rights which they shared with all men everywhere. To give you a contrast, in the Bible, the land of Canaan is promised. the Jewish God promises to the Jewish people, and they had exclusive rights.
Right.
There's nothing exclusive about the rights that the Americans claimed for themselves. They were rights which they shared with all men everywhere. And this is not merely in the Declaration of Independence, but in the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, almost exactly 1 year before the Declaration of Independence, the American Congress declared to the world that it was impossible to believe, no rational person could believe that God made some part of the human race the exclusive property of another part of the human race.
Segment 3, onto the specific question of the specific political context of those debates in 1858. Give me a layman's explanation, an explanation for a layman of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854.
The Missouri Compromise of 1820 resulted in Missouri coming in as a slave state, Maine came in as a free state, but in all the remaining Louisiana territory, the territory acquired from France under the name of Louisiana, north of the southern boundary of Missouri, 3630, all the remaining territory would be forever free. That remained, that put an end to any question as to slavery, which the American people had to decide. Each slave states went their way, the free states went their way, but they had nothing to quarrel about because it was understood and agreed to by Lincoln and the Republicans that the control of their domestic institutions was exclusively the province of the states. The federal government had no jurisdiction over slavery in the slave states. So there was nothing for the American people to decide about slavery until the Mexican War. In the Mexican War, people seldom realized what a vast change that was. The United States took over 60% of the land area of Mexico and increased the land area of the United States by 40%. The question as to what the states that would be formed out of this vast territory, what would be its status as to slavery, became the focal point of the political and moral concern of the American people. Now, one of the important things to understand, and I don't think anybody else has articulated this, I must say, as well as I have done, with the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, which Douglas was in charge of, he was chairman of the Committee on Territories, he wrote the Kansas-Nebraska bill. In order to get Southern support for the bill, he repealed the Missouri Compromise restriction on slavery. His reasons for this was probably he wanted to get the northern route for the Transcontinental Railroad through Chicago, the northern route. That was he owned property there. That was his constituency.
State, right.
And to get the Southerners to give up their claims for the southern route, eventually, of course, there was both the Southern Pacific and the Northern Pacific, but there was only resources for the Northern Pacific then. At that time, Douglas was looked upon by the anti-slavery movement as the incarnation of evil. He was the Antichrist to the anti-slavery movement looked on Douglas in 1854 as the Antichrist.
Because he repealed the Missouri Compromise, so a settled agreement came unstuck.
Right.
And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which he also engineered, correct?
Well, that was the repeal of the Missouri Compromise was part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854.
Segment 4, the House divided. Prior to the debates, Lincoln accepts the Republican nomination for the Senate in Springfield on June 16th. Lincoln's speech, from which you derive the title of A House Divided, Lincoln states, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Close quote. Now, on the face of it, why was that? It's beautifully written, but you have all of American history up to that point suggesting that one way or another, slavery can be contained. We have a new crisis here in the Kansas-Nebraska moment when the question of popular sovereignty, these states could come in slave or they could come in free. But you have all of American history where the slave trade has been abolished, slavery has been successfully contained and made a distinctively Southern institution. Why is he right about that?
Well, in the first place, slavery had not been contained. This is the part that it's hard to understand. What you just said about slavery being sort of on the way out, that was the dominant historical view of the debates and of the Civil War before I came on the scene. But if you look at the reality of the Dred Scott decision, you will find that the principal argument of the Chief Justice about slavery was that the right to own slaves is expressly affirmed in the Constitution. That's what Tawney said. And that's what the Southerners all believed, although there's not a word of truth in it. But they believed it because it was there.
Dred Scott was 1857.
Just before the... And according to the Chief Justice, the right to own slaves is expressly affirmed in the Constitution. But Article 4 of the Constitution says that this Constitution and the laws pursuant thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. Anything in any constitution, state constitutional law to the contrary notwithstanding. Now you put those two statements together, and slavery is lawful in every state of the Union.
Suddenly you have the institution, far from gradually withering, it becomes extremely aggressive and expansive.
Right. And now Douglas accepted the Tawney's decision, but he tried to show that Tawney's pronouncement was merely abstract, and that in fact in any territory the slave owner could not, people couldn't have slavery in, say, Kansas, unless the local legislature gave them the laws supporting it, and which was not true for one thing. But in any case, Douglas was trying to do it both ways, you see.
He's the straddler.
And Lincoln's whole campaign was to show that if the Tawney decision was right, then slavery in fact was national, and it was. See, the Supreme Court only decided that slavery was necessary in Kansas, but the logic of their argument applied as well to states, although they didn't rule specifically on states. But if Lincoln felt that unless the Dred Scott was itself rejected, that slavery would become lawful in all of the states. And it just happened that in the first of the joint debates, the Ottawa debate, Lincoln spent about half an hour reading from a speech that Douglas had given 3 months earlier, in which Douglas denounced the Washington Union, which meant President Buchanan, for saying that slavery was already lawful in the free states. And that's the thing that ultimately destroyed Douglas.
Segment 5 here. I'm quoting again from Crisis of the House Divided. This may be, in this entire magnificent work, published 50 years ago, this may be the most important sentence, in my opinion. Ready?
Okay.
Lincoln's interpretation of the phrase from the Declaration, all men are created equal, transforms that proposition from a norm which prescribes what civil society ought not to be, which you argue it was in the Declaration, into a transcendental affirmation of what civil society ought to be. Close quote. Explain that.
Well, it's really explained in The New Birth of Freedom.
That's our next program.
Right.
But Lincoln, well, let me put it this way then. Political philosopher Michael Zuckert writes this of you. Harry Jaffa holds, quote, that Lincoln corrected the work of the founders Indeed, Jaffa presents Lincoln as the statesman, poet, philosopher who put the nation on a sounder footing than the founders themselves had left it. Close quote. How do you plead?
Guilty.
Guilty. And how did Lincoln do that?
Well, when I say guilty, I think that in Crisis of the House Divided, I did look upon Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton and the others and Washington as basically creatures of modern philosophy, which ultimately leads to relativism and nihilism, and that Lincoln had resisted that. In the 40 years that separate the two books, I came to the
Crisis of the House Divided and A New Birth of Freedom.
Yeah, I came to the
published in
conclusion
2000.
that the founding itself was classical, and I have lots of examples of the classicism of the founders. One of my main documents is, well, there's a couple. One is George Washington's inaugural speech, in which he said that the foundations of public policy shall be laid in the immutable principles of private morality, since there is no truth more firmly established in the entire economy of nature than the indissoluble union of virtue and happiness. Now, Aristotle couldn't have said it differently or better. So this is not modern philosophy. This is classical philosophy. So wait a minute.
Go ahead.
In Washington, when Washington said the indissoluble union of virtue and happiness, that meant the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, meant the pursuit of virtue. My friends and former friends, the Eastern Straussians, they think the pursuit of happiness is idiosyncratic. It's radical individualism. But,
license.
Yeah, but Washington said no. And Jefferson had the same view.
So in Jefferson, Lincoln, Washington, what makes them classical is the notion that there is something outside and above, some objective, Aquinas would have called it the ground of being. There is some objective reality to which even popular sovereignty is subject.
Absolutely.
And must aspire. The notion of radical individualism, license, pursuit of happiness means 500 channels on the cable television. That's not so. The pursuit of happiness means the pursuit of virtue, the freedom to conform oneself to ideals, to virtue. I'm fumbling around, but I'm looking.
If you take the question of, say, popular sovereignty, in a letter that Jefferson wrote to, forget the man who was Chief Justice of Virginia, they both hated Jefferson and a lot of things. But Jefferson said the principles of the Constitution, the ultimate source for the principles of the Constitution are the people en masse. They alone are subject to nothing but the moral law. The moral law makes the people. The people do not make the moral law. A Nazi people is not a people in the meaning of the Declaration, unless there's a recognition of an objective basis for morality. Then there cannot be any true morality.
So any
true democracy.
When Lincoln uses biblical language, the House Divided, which of course is a paraphrase from the Gospel of St. Matthew, and much of his language seems, the very rhythms of it seem rooted in the Bible. He's not simply reaching for beautiful language. He's actually reaching into this kind of taproot of objective reality, natural law. I'm fumbling here, but is that correct?
Yeah, but almost everything that Lincoln, his great statements of Lincoln, most of them are reviving and rephrasing things that he got from Jefferson. In the Notes on Virginia, Jefferson says that, will the liberties of a people be secure when we have abolished their only sure foundation? The belief that they are of the gift of God and may not be violated but with his wrath. And that's followed by, I tremble for my country when I remember that God is just. Lincoln's second inaugural, it's all there.
Dr. Harry Jaffa, on the 50th anniversary of the publication of this magnificent book, Crisis of the House Divided, thank you for joining us. For Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution, I'm Peter Robinson.